Um, yeah, it's just enraging, to put it mildly. Laith Marouf. Laith Marouf is an award-winning producer and broadcasting law consultant. How you doing, Laith? You doing okay today?
Good to be with you, Jamal. Thank you for the invitation.
No, man, always. I wanted to get your take on this because you've been one of the people that I've brought onto the channel. I've always appreciated your point of view, whether we agree or not. And you are, for one, in the area, you do damn good reporting on the events that are taking place on the ground. And so now that apparently Donald Trump, or the reporting seems to go with Donald Trump pushing Netanyahu into a ceasefire, or at the very least a quote unquote truce. There are so many thoughts on this. For one, it seems that the Joe Biden administration just didn't push. All the reporting at this point comes out that Joe Biden, for all of the moaning, for all of the griping that was coming out the Biden administration, behind the scenes, there was no pressure on the Israeli government at all. And then you get Trump, who comes in and says, get the deal. In which case, it seems, according to reporting, that Netanyahu was pushed into a deal. And you get all of the screaming out of Channel 4 News, or for that matter, out of the Israeli government, that they didn't necessarily want to do it. Give me your take on this. For one, how do you see the deal? All of the reporting is that this is the same deal that was on the table for the last 6 to 8 months.
Yeah. This is exactly the Biden proposal from 8 months ago. And, I don't personally believe all the hype and propaganda about Trump forcing Netanyahu or strong-arming him or threatening him into agreeing to this ceasefire. Mm-hmm. I think this is all part of the rebranding of the empire that the deep state, that the Zionists are part of, do. Trump has been selling himself as the strong man versus the liberal weakling Biden. That was kind of the branding that is coming out from the empire as a whole, even before the election. And we saw, of course, what happened with Biden in his debate with Trump, which clearly was a managed affair. Nobody would have put Biden in a debate months in advance of the election out of the blue if they didn't want him to lose on purpose as a state, or at least make it look like he lost the vote, because ultimately I don't even believe that there's a democracy in the US. So I think this is all rebranding, preparing the world stage for Trump. This morning, finally, Netanyahu's government signed on to the ceasefire agreement. Mm-hmm. And it should come into effect hours before the inauguration on the 19th. And the first steps of the quote-unquote ceasefire will come on the day of the inauguration. So it's clearly all managed to fit the branding of Trump as a new emperor.
No, I accept that. I mean, like I said before, if anything, Donald Trump's ego, I don't believe would allow him to be humiliated in the way that Joe Biden was humiliated. Because, over and over again, Netanyahu seemed to take any and every opportunity to make Joe Biden look incompetent or look weak. And for Donald Trump's own self-conception, I don't get the sense that he would allow himself to look weak in that way, in which case he told the Arab community, I'm going to get a deal, I'm going to end the war. Kamala Harris told the Arab community that nothing was going to fundamentally change. The Arab community seemed to believe him, in which case they voted for him en masse and pulled those votes away from the Democratic Party. And to Donald Trump's credit, he did say, I want to end wars, not start them. And so, he put out the Jeffrey Sachs thing, calling Netanyahu a deep, dark son of a bitch. And people didn't know how to place that. And then you get the reporting that Donald Trump was pushing Netanyahu into a deal, and that the Israeli government was screaming that they didn't want to accept the deal. Because the rub is, if they accept the deal, that means Hamas won. Regardless of the devastating toll that the Palestinians took, Hamas is a resistance group, and the expressed interest of Israel was to eliminate Hamas, and Hamas is still there nonetheless. How do you view that, by the way? Do you view it in those terms, that the expressed interest of Israel was to eliminate Hamas as a political and military entity? And Blinken, in one of his recent speeches, pointed out that Hamas has reconstituted itself. Um, Give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, obviously, decolonization wars are costly for the people that are seeking liberation. There is no decolonization war that, since World War II, that cost less than 6 million people in sacrifice. When we count what happened in Vietnam, the millions dead in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, or when we talk about the Algerian liberation struggle. So similarly, the price that the Palestinians were going to pay in order to achieve this liberation from colonialism was going to be high. And as we also should note from liberation struggles, is that you don't judge the winner and the loser by the amount of dead civilians or destruction of infrastructure and civilian housing. Much of Vietnam was destroyed before the Americans left. Similarly, majority of North Korea was destroyed before the defeat of the Americans there. So we don't judge who's the winner and the loser by how many civilians were killed. Similarly, the Germans killed, close to 30 million. The Nazis basically killed close to 30 million civilians in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe.
Yep.
And that includes, of course, the millions that died in the quote-unquote Holocaust. So but in the end, Germany lost. Although it had less civilian losses, less infrastructure destruction, but it lost the war. So here is the same situation. The Israelis were attempting not only to defeat and destroy Hamas, they were attempting to defeat the will of resistance within the Palestinian people.
Mm-hmm.
And what they ultimately did is actually reinforce that will of resistance and expand that will of resistance to a global scale. So right now, if there was before the genocide in Gaza, a big chunk of European, North American population that was supportive of Israel, and or anyone in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that was confused and didn't know the story of the Palestinian people, today the whole globe, the vast majority of humanity, is anti-Zionist and cannot see a future where the Zionist colony has a right to exist. So the seeds of the destruction, the end of the Zionist project, have already been planted and are flowering, actually. We're almost going to get to the fruiting stage of that. So the Zionists lost the war in Gaza. They have been unable to defeat the population and the will of the Palestinian people. And there's no going back now for this project.
That is a good point. I mean, how do you commit a massacre, a genocide, and then expect to go back to some level of normality? What's interesting, and I guess there are 2 points or 2 questions. One, Smotrich and Ben Gvir have effectively said that they were going to collapse the government if Netanyahu accepted the deal, because from their point of view, this was considered to be a loss. They wanted to annex Gaza. They wanted to annex the West Bank. They may get to annex the West Bank, by the way. We don't know what Trump gave assurances on in order to get the ceasefire, as you said, to be the big strongman. We also don't know whether or not Israel will use any provocation as a justification to resume conflict. because I don't have this belief that if Israel resumes, that the U.S. is going to, let's say, be a hard ass in regards to pressing them to stop. Up to this point, anything that they've done, the U.S. has effectively backed them on, regardless of how deceitful they were being. So they're supposed to pull out of Gaza. They're supposed to pull out of Philadelphia corridor. They're supposed to give back thousands of the hostages that Israel was holding, and get the hostages back that Hamas was holding. At some point, they're supposed to exchange the corpses of the various people. Do you believe that the Israeli government is going to collapse if and when they start to implement this deal, considering that the hardliners in the government are completely against it?
Well, Netanyahu is a cat with 9 lives. He definitely proved himself as to be the politician in Israel that can survive the most changes. And, if Smotrich and Ben Gvir withdraw, there's all the quote-unquote liberals in the Israeli parliament that would be glad to join with Netanyahu and get back to the situation of having a unity government, as was in the beginning of the war on Gaza, before
I see.
Labid and the others withdrew from the government, and then Netanyahu made the deal with Ben Gvir and Smotrich. So he's still the kingmaker, and his party is still the biggest party in the parliament, in the Knesset. So I think some other parties will join him in government. Now, let's presume that this is the worst, and actually Netanyahu is unable to create a new government with the other parties. Well, it's going to actually spell the end of Netanyahu, and anyone that was in his government as a cabinet ministers is going to now expose them to a higher risk of arrest under the ICC arrest warrants, because he will not have any more, prime ministerial immunity. Okay, so he's not going to be anymore an elected official of a government. And so I think he will try his best to balance his government with other parties if Ben Gvir and Smotrich withdraw.
That's a good point. I mean, because Netanyahu has a criminal case looming already, that he knows that the moment that he gets out of government, he is fair game. And, the prosecution have been going after him on this front, even in Israel itself. So you're absolutely right. He's probably going to do any and everything in his power to stay in power. One of the other questions is, where do the Palestinians go back to? I mean, something like 70% of all the houses, the dwellings, the buildings have been fundamentally flattened. And I mean, like literally just gone. The hospitals, all of the hospitals in northern Gaza have been destroyed. Israel clearly went into this with the idea that they were going to take this territory and clear all of it out, meaning we don't want anybody coming back and living in this particular part of Gaza. It seems that that's not really going to be the case now, that they're pulling back. But the fact that they're pulling back and they're going to allow people to come back into the area, where are these people expected to go when everything has been destroyed?
Well, the Palestinian people will go back to their homes even if they're destroyed, and they will pitch a tent on top of the rubble of their homes. This is the strong will of the Palestinian people. This is not to say that the reconstruction efforts are going to be easy. In fact, I think there's more rubble right now in Gaza than any other war zone ever. So just removing the rubble is going to take years, let alone building a replacement housing and so forth. And
I mean, Laith, real quick, just to interrupt on that point. They were destroying blocks of residences at once, meaning there are videos of Israel attaching like dynamite or bombs or explosives to various houses and then just blowing them up. The guy in Brazil, if you remember, the one that they're trying to prosecute in Brazil, that Israel was trying to effectively sneak out of it because they were going to prosecute him for war crimes. What they were going to prosecute him for was effectively blowing up a block, like an entire block. I've never seen anything like it. It wasn't even like them dropping a bomb. It was them attaching explosives to a demolition thing of just blowing it all up at once. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to back up the point.
And they actually sneaked him out
So they did get him out.
to Argentina, where there's the Zionist freak president there who just got awarded the highest award in the Israeli state, President Milei of Argentina.
Yeah.
So look, the amount of destruction is actually higher than 90% of all structures are destroyed. So it's not even 70 somewhat percent. So there's the destruction is unimaginable, and the ceasefire agreement, the last step in it, the fifth step in it, is the beginning of the reconstruction. So we will see if that will ever happen. But you could imagine that the amount of cement that needs to come into Gaza is going to be remarkable. And traditionally, the Israelis didn't allow cement to come into Gaza because of the fear that it's going to be used in building tunnels. So how is this going to happen? Who's going to flip the bill? It's going to be billions of dollars to try to reconstruct that strip. And of course, all of this doesn't have anything to do with the West Bank. We don't know what's going to happen in the West Bank. Will the Israelis actually begin a similar campaign in the West Bank? We already saw a few days ago the Israelis fire from an F-15 on a residential block in Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank and killed 5 civilians and injured tens. So the war could break out any moment again. Now, and we already also, by the way, heard Kushner, the son-in-law of Trump, is throwing right now a couple of $1 billion on building settlements in the West Bank and investing in construction companies that build settlements in the West Bank. So that can give us a hint that maybe Trump will be declaring the West Bank as part of the Zionist colony, and what that will trigger, how the resistance in Gaza, other places will respond. So this war is not over. It's just we are entering a different stage of it.
Just to show people what we're talking about, just to give some context. Now that Joe Biden is leaving, 60 Minutes and the media can report on what this stuff looks like. I mean, that's astonishing. Like in this article, they were talking about how kids were playing with bombs, like US made missiles and bombs, and they were using it for tents, all sorts of stuff. Like, this is the legacy that we're leaving in this area, and we paid for it. We paid for all of this. Look at this. I mean, this is outrageous.
I mean, look, the whole U.S. And the whole empire that it controls, they have ruined their reputation. All the propaganda that was expended by the United States since World War II to convince the rest of the world that we all have to believe in the American dream or follow the ways that the American society works and so on to be prosperous, and or this idea of human rights and international law and what have you, have been burned in the Holocaust of Gaza.
Yeah.
So the reputation of the West as a whole and the ability of the West to even project soft power is gone. So this is why we see the whole empire now depending 100% on military might to to project his power. So, and we see that playing out, of course, here. And look, I think, Trump with his statements that he's going to take Greenland, Canada, and Panama and change the Gulf of Mexico into the Gulf of America, those are not statements of somebody that's not ready to go to war. And also, actually, these are statements of somebody that is openly saying, we live now in an imperial age. All that era of post-World War II has been closed, and we're back to the situation at the end of the 1800s of countries occupying territory and annexing it, whether it's the Turks in Syria, the Israelis in Syria, and what have you. And he's telling the world, deal with it. If you can't stop me, you can't stop me. So this is how we are right now, where we are.
So I think it's a yes and a no. I think when Donald Trump looks at the world, meaning I agree with you and I disagree with you. From the standpoint of Syria, agreed, 1,000%. From the standpoint of Israel and Turkey, 1,000%, agreed. I think what Donald Trump is looking at is this kind of idea of spheres of influence, that from the U.S. standpoint, we want Greenland and Canada because we need to be able to compete with Russia, China, Iran, and he sees the world organizing against the U.S. Now, they're organizing against the U.S. because we have been belligerent and we have been a violent actor on the world stage. But I think he's looking at it as, for one, Greenland can't stop me, or Denmark can't stop me. Europe is already a vassal. The U.S. needs to be bigger in order to deal with the threats of the 21st century. I think that's the way he's looking at it. But I don't think, from his point of view, he needs to go to war in order to get those things. But I do agree with you that the world seems to be in a different place with this. I want, what is Gaza going to look like after? Okay, let me answer this way. Assume for the moment that this deal is what this deal says it is, meaning that the reporting on it is correct. And assume for the moment that humanitarian aid and resources at some point are going to come into Gaza. Has there been any conversation about what the government is going to look like in Gaza going forward?
Yeah, I mean, the ceasefire agreement doesn't mention anything about the formation of the Palestinian governance inside Gaza. And I think this is a very important admittance by the Zionists and the empire as a whole that Hamas is a fact and it is the controlling force inside Gaza, and there's no challenge to that. There's no ability to change that. So we remember for a whole year they were telling us that the PA of Abbas, the collaborationist president of the PA, will be the ones that's going to govern and so forth. Well, that's all gone. There's no discussion about that anymore. So it will be Hamas governing with the other factions that carried arms against the Zionist colony and invasion. And I think this is also going to infect what's happening in the West Bank. Okay, so if the Israelis attempt to crush the Palestinian resistance in the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority continues to collaborate in this process in the West Bank, I think at any moment there will be a confrontation between the Palestinian resistance and the collaborationist class with Mahmoud Abbas, and things could go out of hand very easily in the West Bank, all because of the situation in Gaza. So Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, others that carried arm now are the only legitimate voice to represent the Palestinians because they have defended Palestine and the Palestinian people and have won resoundingly this battle against the mighty empire governed from DC.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. What happens in the West Bank? I mean, Donald Trump apparently got $100 million with an agreement that he was going to annex or allow Israel to annex the West Bank, effectively just steal the West Bank outright. What is your expectation if indeed they sign a deal in Gaza and yet they go and try to annex the West Bank, what do you think happens in that situation? Does Hamas reinvigorate itself and continues and presses another attack? Do forces in the West Bank resume and initiate a resistance? What do you think happens in the situation? Because I agree with you. It's very possible that what Donald Trump did was saying, look, Bibi, I'll give you the West Bank if you end this or give a ceasefire in Gaza, basically transactional in the way that he's thinking about it, especially since he got money to do just that. What happens if indeed that's what Israel attempts to do in this situation?
Yeah, look, if they do annex the West Bank, which I do expect, I think it will be the last bullet in the head of Zionism. And the Zionists right now have given up on all formalities and or propaganda and any of that, and are have resorted to kind of the wild beast mentality, thinking that just killing en masse is victory, right?
Yep.
And this level of arrogance and supremacy and detachment from reality, we can see it how it's playing out in Syria, the overstretch of their military occupying huge swaths of Syria. There's no air defense there. There's the collaborationist Wahhabis in Damascus, the HTS, that are letting them continue occupying land and stealing resources. But at any moment, one Syrian with a sniper rifle can ruin the whole presence of Israel in southern Syria. Similarly, this West Bank is not a small area like Gaza, and there are settlers everywhere intermingled in between Palestinian villages and Palestinian towns. If there is an actual annexation that happens, and that triggers a full-out war, Israel will find itself, kind of with its with this behind exposed. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be as easy. Well, it was never easy in Gaza, but it will be even much more complicated. And the amount of destruction that they will have to conduct across this huge swath of land to achieve even what they couldn't achieve in Gaza is going to be huge. So I think the more that Israel entrenches itself, the more it expands, the more it loots, the more it occupies, the weaker it is. And they're not like, there's a limited amount of soldiers they have. Mm-hmm. There's a limited amount of resources that the U.S. can continue to send to it. And I think one of the main factors of why the U.S. finally got the Zionists to stop the war in Gaza is because of how much it's affecting the ability of the United States to move its weapons and its assets, security and satellite and intelligence and all of that around the world in the last 16 months because of the concentration on this war in Gaza. You have to realize basically, the United States lost, I think, 12 MQ-9s over Yemen.
Oh,
I think the whole
Yemen was shooting them down. Yeah.
Yeah, the whole fleet of the United States is something like, I think, 30 or 40 of those MQ-9s. So you lost a third of the MQ-9s in this battle. So that affects the ability of the United States to monitor other locations in the world. If every satellite, that has surveillance capabilities was moved to be stationed over Gaza for the last 16 months, what did that mean to other fronts? So imagine that you have to do it in the West Bank on a much larger scale territory. How much of the resources of the empire will have to be dedicated to this? So I think there's contradictory things that are happening within the empire. It doesn't know Where's priorities? Even those statements by Trump about Greenland, Canada, and Panama, this is not something easy. I mean, I can tell you something right now. Maybe there will be not one Canadian that will carry arms against the US if the US occupies. And I mean Canadian, white Canadian. But you know, there's 2 million indigenous people in Canada, and they're armed to the teeth. And the last time the Canadian military had a confrontation with the indigenous nations of Canada was in 1995 in the Chipatan Lake standoff, or what's called in English the Gustafson Lake standoff, where 7 indigenous warriors held to a standstill 7,000 Canadian soldiers for 6 months in the woods. And they had to fire on them 77,000 rounds of ammunition. Okay, they used planes, tanks, APCs, landmines to try to defeat them. Okay, so you can imagine if something like that breaks out in Canada. Canada is the second largest country in the world, land mass wise. There's no way you can, keep hold of this country if the indigenous people actually decide to revolt.
Yeah. To be fair, I don't think he's trying to militarily take Canada. And Trump talks a lot. Greenland, yes, I'm pretty sure he actually wants Greenland. Whether he gets it or not is secondary to the point. But I really do think, from his point of view, he's looking at, I don't think this want is an issue of strength. I think it's an issue of weakness, or at the very least, a perceived weakness that Donald Trump feels like he's confronting a different world. But no, I don't think he's trying to militarily take Greenland. I mean, he even said it himself. He wants to use economic force, quote unquote, to force Canada to be the 51st state.
The Canadian Prime Minister met with the. I'm saying all these things because I'm a Canadian citizen. Okay.
Oh, so okay. Fair enough. Fair enough.
I watch Canadian news, although it's very boring. But the Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau met with the premiers of the provinces. A premier is like a governor of a state in Canada, and the most significant economically to the relation with the U.S. premier is the premier of Alberta. She didn't show up to the meeting. Alberta is where all the oil and gas of Canada is, and is exported to the United States primarily. Mm-hmm. And she refused to sign on to the joint statement of the premiers and the prime minister that condemned the threats of tariffs on Canada. And, in the statement, they're talking about counter tariffs and so forth, and having a trade war basically with the United States. So clearly, Alberta will secede and join the United States if Trump, pushes. And then Canada will not have any oil, and it will be also have a gap in the middle of it, and so it's clear that he can get Canada if he wants to, if he pushes a little bit more.
It's like if you just a little pushing, you might be able to get it. Explain something to me about the West Bank. And I guess there are 2 questions on this. One, I've only been to Bethlehem in the West Bank. I've only been to that area once. And are they intermingled? Like, meaning, if Israel tries to annex the West Bank, is it a similar situation as Gaza, where it's a separate entity, or are the Palestinians and Israelis enmeshed together? Meaning, are they going to be able to do the bombing and the killing in the way that they did before in the West Bank because you had a separate community? Or is it a different process? Is it a different setup? I hope that question makes sense. I'm trying to get my head around and try to get it an image to the audience of what the population density is like among Palestinians and Israelis, and are they living together in that area?
Yeah, so they are not like living together as in the same village or the same town or the same city. But there'll be, let's say you went to Bethlehem, it's surrounded on the, the hilltops right around it are settlements. Okay, so you can do maybe air bombardment of Palestinian cities, but the Palestinians don't need to fire rockets at settlements as they were doing in Gaza.
I
They
see.
can just cross the fence into a settlement that's just beside their community and start shooting up. Okay.
I see. It's a different
So
animal. Yeah.
yes, so the Israelis will need to deploy their military fully in every colony in the West Bank to defend it. Okay, so it's a much harder situation, and or they have to besiege every Palestinian village, town, and city, and that you need a huge amount of military deployment to do so. And if they deploy their majority of their military in the West Bank to suppress the Palestinians, well, then what's going to happen on the border with Lebanon? What's going to happen on the border with Gaza? So it is not a viable situation militarily for the Israelis. So I think and if they commence a genocide in the West Bank, how is the world going to respond? You see, like, I don't think anybody, even those few Christian Zionists, how will they respond when they see the Nativity Church being bombed in Bethlehem?
They would
What's going
accept.
to be the see?
They would accept
So
it.
things are different. Things are different in the West Bank than in Gaza, and I think it's a totally different beast.
Okay. Well, I wanted you to give me your take on this statement by Blinken. And I hate to play anything that Blinken is putting out, but I do want to get your take on this, because there's a question of what was this for if what Blinken's saying is true.
Void. Indeed, we assess that Hamas has recruited almost as many new militants as it has lost. That is a recipe for an enduring insurgency and perpetual war. The longer the war goes on, the worse the humanitarian situation gets in Gaza.
So if that's true, that for all intents and purposes, after all of this killing, that Hamas is effectively reconstituted itself. I mean, for one, is it true? And two, what does it mean if it is true after killing, like the Lancet is talking about, over 100,000 people, most of which were civilians?
Yeah, I think the number of dead is probably closer to 300,000. We'll know as the rubble is pulled out, as we start being able to count all those who died from starvation and the effects of medical negligence, and not being able to reach their medicines and have operations and what have you. So I think it's much larger number. Now, I am 100% sure that not only Hamas, but all the armed Palestinian factions have recruited more than they had even in the beginning of the genocide in Gaza. And that is because, for the simple fact that anyone that was pacifist and or nonviolent in their resistance to Israel before the genocide, anyone that had criticism for Hamas, Islamic Jihad, or whatever before the genocide in Gaza, those who then had to watch their whole life being destroyed by Israel, the indiscriminate killing of their relatives and families and friends, they have now been radicalized. And most probably the Palestinian resistance groups are receiving an overwhelming amount of applications to become militants in these groups that they can't even respond to, because they don't have enough training capabilities and or enough personal weapons to arm these individuals. Yeah. I think I've seen so many times this being posted on social media by different Palestinians saying, I hated Hamas before from Gaza, and or I was criticizing them, or I was nonviolent. If anyone gives me right now, not only a machine gun to shoot an Israeli, if somebody gives me a suicide belt, I'll put it on right now.
Yeah.
Okay? So this is the normal reaction.
Well, yeah.
I think something else that people should realize, that since the 1930s, there's been a nonstop rebellion by the Palestinians, and at every stage, There was a huge defeat and or genocide of whatever movement that there was. So in the 1930s, for instance, there was the first general strike in Palestine. Still, the British occupation was there. The Palestinians were asking the British to leave and to stop the process of building the Zionist colony, and that was led by, Palestinian and Arab unificationist nationalists, and they were all slaughtered by the British. And that led us to by the 1960s, the rise of the PLO, and, Palestinian Liberation Movement, that was, liberal, that included also the leftist communists like the PFLP, who were defeated by the 1970s, and that brought us by the 1980s the Islamic version of liberation with Hamas and Islamic Jihad. So it doesn't matter how much the West, even if Hamas and Islamic Jihad were destroyed, which they haven't been, or defeated militarily, which they haven't, they would have been a birth of a new version of a Palestinian liberation movement that will, put on a different ideological, perspective to itself. But in the end, all the Palestinian people want liberation, and this is a path that cannot be diverted except through the total genocide of the Palestinian people, like the genocide of the indigenous people in the United States is the only thing that stopped them from continuing to resist.
One last question before I let you go. So, the reporting, and I guess it's true at this point, it's understood to be true. The Netanyahu government or the Israeli government was giving money to Hamas in order to create a division and separation between the PLO or the PA, Palestinian Authority, and Hamas, basically creating a division between the West Bank and Gaza itself, with the notion that if you can make Hamas the face of the opposition, you can break the coalition and the cooperation between Gaza and the West Bank, weakening both in the process of doing so. Is there any potential for a reunification of sorts, whether that's the West Bank goes in a different political direction, whether that's the PA and Hamas coming to some kind of terms to create a political coalition or political force against the Israeli government and against the occupation? Or is that off the table?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the Palestinian Authority and Fatah as a party have destroyed themselves and their reputation within the Palestinian population. There's no way they can save themselves. I think if I was Mahmoud Abbas and the goons around him, I'll be always worried about somebody assassinating me from the Palestinian people, maybe even somebody in their family. Mm-hmm. So it's this point of Israel allowing money to come into Gaza in the 1980s to help Hamas become a opponent or to break the control that Fatah had. Yes, that happened, but because that only happened because Fatah began becoming more and more liberal and eventually ended up with the Oslo Agreement. And Hamas and Islamic Jihad were gonna rise with or without the interference of the Israelis, because people were already looking for an alternative to the beginnings of surrender that Fatah led. So I don't think we should put too much weight on the idea that Israel was responsible for this. And one last thing here I would say is that, when all options that are rather, humanist from their roots are defeated, as happened with, let's say, the communists, the socialists, the liberals, all were defeated by the Israelis and imperialists by the collapse of the Soviet Union. The only thing that oppressed people have to fall on by that point was religion, was God.
Yeah.
Even when we read what Marx said about religion as the opium of the masses, he doesn't mean that it's a bad thing that is drugging people. He's saying it's the only thing that can bring them happiness in this misery of capitalism and imperialism. Like a impoverished person, goes and seeks drugs to find some happiness in their moment. So this is the condition of the defeat of the anti-colonization movements and the Soviet Union and progressive movements around the world by the American empire by 1990 and the late 80s, basically, led us to having people falling back to religion as their escape. And I would say one more thing. I think, look at the Palestinian people. If they didn't have right now this religious conviction that kept them going during this genocide, or the Lebanese people, right? If they didn't have this religious conviction, would they have been able to resist this way? No. And so even though I am a secularist in my political leanings, I would never wish that the Palestinian people or the Lebanese people give up their religiosity, not until definitely the defeat of Zionism.
And by the way, we did it in the US too. It was just in a different religion. I mean, if you're thinking of Black revolutionary movements or struggle, if you think of Martin Luther King, again, Christian, he used it despite being a socialist, it went in the context of faith. Malcolm X, again, went in the context of faith. And so, yeah, when you have people in situations where it's hard to see a way out logically, religion becomes this kind of, you can hold on something, this kind of belief in the unseen, this belief that we're going to fix this. This is going to change. We're going to get some level of liberation. No, I totally get it. I got to get one last thing from you. I want to get your take on something. Donald Trump this was years ago, and I played this for, who was I talking to yesterday? I can't think of his name. I played it for him yesterday, and Peter Coffin, he was shocked that this video existed. This is Trump having a conversation about Abbas and Netanyahu when he apparently met them. Give me your point of view on this. This was fascinating to me.
I think it's a terrible personal trait. I haven't spoken to him since, huh? I don't know. I thought he wanted to make a deal more than Netanyahu. And I will be honest, I had a great meeting with him, Abbas, right? I had a great meeting with him. And we spent a lot of time together, talked about many things. And it was almost like a father. I mean, he was so nice. Couldn't have been nicer. And after meeting with Bibi for 3 minutes, I looked at him and said, "You don't want to make a deal, do you?" And he said, "Well, and the fact is, I don't think Bibi ever wanted to make a deal. Why? I thought the Palestinians were impossible, that the Israelis would do anything to make peace and a deal. I found that not to be true."
I'm amazed by that clip, because that is like the exact opposite of what Trump is saying today. But that has to be still rattling around in his mind, regardless of what he's saying openly today. Give me your take on this, and this could be the end. We can close it on this.
Yeah, I mean, look, Trump, what's good about him is that he's a frank person, okay? There is no handlers that can handle him even, okay? Even if they try to coach him to say some things, he just blabs out what he thinks. Yeah. And that's great. We've heard so many truth nuggets coming out of Trump that we haven't heard from US presidents for decades.
Yeah.
Even in the end, let's say, he screws over everybody. But at least, he's being honest sometimes. And I think this is what most American people, whether they're Arabic or not, voted for him, because they at least can get some truth from him. And that's why people voted for him. And they're hoping that he can continue, at least say some truth while he's governing. Everybody knows that the American government is not good for its people, whoever is in charge. But at least let us have a good show, and that includes some facts. Not all delusion by delusion.
Yeah, he's the one who's like, we're just taking the oil, stealing the oil, taking the oil. It's like the most shameless, honest thing in the world, right?
It's better. It's better.
It's. I agree with. And look, every so often, getting some level of reality as opposed to somebody lying to you. You'll take it even if you don't like it, right? Laith Marouf. He is an award-winning multimedia producer and broadcasting law consultant. You can follow Laith. Laith, I always ask you for this. Where are you today? You're on. I have cmacenter.org in my document, but I don't think that's right. You're in a different.
freepalestine.video is the community television station that I'm the executive director at. We are producing content from the ground in the West Bank, in Lebanon, and in Jordan, and all in English. Daily news reports. You can see freepalestine.video is the website, and we're on at least 12 different social media platforms. You can follow us there. Please donate, if you have an ability to do so.
Fantastic, man. Thank you for this, Laith. I really appreciate it. Be safe, man.
You have a nice day.
Alrighty. Fantastic interview. I really appreciate Laith joining me for this. I wanted his take on it because I brought him on the show to have this conversation about what is taking place in the area several times. And so it felt right to get his point of view on this.